I'm Bill Dutton, Director of the Oxford Internet Institute. Really delighted to welcome you here today. This is not a mini Internet Governance Forum. It is not the advisory committee to the Internet Governance Forum. It is a university event that's meant to inform and help and support the efforts that are going on by the Internet Governance Forum. We thought what we might be able to do from a perspective of a university, pulling the right people together, is to help inform the larger public about the issues that will be discussed at the Internet Governance Forum. Today's event is meant to kick off a larger event. Tomorrow, a smaller group will sit around a small room at the OII of 25 people and hammer out what we mean by the various issues that are being raised for the Internet Governance Forum. And that'll be made available to everyone interested in these issues as soon as possible. I'd like to thank the Berkman Center for the Internet and Society for collaborating with us on this, as well as we've had help from the James Martin School of the 21st Century, the eHorizons Institute in particular, and also Net Dialogue. A number of people have chipped in their expertise and contacts and so forth to help pull this event together. We'll be webcast. This will not be a live webcast, but it'll be available probably next week for those of you who wish to recommend someone else to see this, and hopefully a larger public can see it. We want to thank a number of sponsors, including Nominet UK, Filius, ISOC. It wouldn't have been possible to bring some people who could not afford to come otherwise, and to have exactly the people we needed here if it were not for that support, and we're very grateful for it. With that, I just want to welcome you again. I hope you, tomorrow, the idea is that we're going to focus on what are the issues and how to clarify those issues. But tonight, the idea was that there's really no limit, and it's what's on people's minds and what people think they want to address with respect to the Internet Governance Forum. And I'd like to just simply introduce the chair, Jeanette Hofmann, who's a research fellow at the Social Science Research Center in Berlin. She was one of the co-chairs of the Civil Society Internet Governance Caucus at WSIS, and she really was part of the German delegation at WSIS, and I think was recruited early on to help chair the Internet Governance Caucus, and became a real leader in that caucus because she agreed to do whatever and asked her to do, and also worked very hard to pull that together. I had a really great interview with her on a boat to Dresden, and learned all about her efforts, and was so impressed. And so I can't think of anybody better able to lead a discussion of the issues and the future of the Internet Governance Forum. So Jeanette Hofmann.
Yes, I like to welcome you to this event on the Internet Governance Forum's first meeting that covers the theme Internet Governance for Development. Before I introduce our three distinguished speakers, I would like to say a few words about the background of the formation of the Internet Governance Forum. It seems fair to say that the Internet Governance Forum could evolve into a real institutional innovation in the broader context of international relations. Now, it's perhaps not too untypical for innovations that there are always some observers who are enthusiastic about innovations and others that are more skeptical or perhaps even negative about it. Personally, I rather belong to the first camp. I very much welcome the decision of the World Summit to be a bit creative and establish, at least for a few years, such a new entity. I will briefly tell you why I think this is a good idea. In my view, one of the surprising outcomes of the World Summit was that it put internet governance into a truly new context. Before WSIS, internet governance was more or less equated with coordinating internet names and numbers, or in other words, with what ICANN is supposed to administrate. We took this understanding of internet governance for granted. And even though the term internet governance had been around for a decade or so, nobody had ever tried to define it in a more systematic way. WSIS has thoroughly changed that. Due to WSIS, the common understanding of internet governance has been challenged in various ways. I want to point out only three. The first concerns the core issues of internet governance. During the first phase of WSIS, there was a long discussion about whether we should stick to a rather narrow definition of internet governance, which would cover just internet names and numbers, or whether we should rather take a broad approach to internet governance. A related issue concerned the question of development. It was unclear at that point whether questions like digital gap, capacity building, whether that would be part of our understanding of internet governance or rather outside of it. The second aspect concerns actors and institutional arrangements. Who is or should be responsible for coordinating internet governance? Does private self-governance, as we associate it with ICANN, constitute an adequate solution, or are there roles also for other players like governments, intergovernmental organizations, and finally, what is the role of civil society in this area? The third point concerns the problem of legitimacy and accountability. One of the questions that was discussed at WSIS was whether the current processes and institutions represent really the interests of all stakeholders in a sufficient way. Can internet users, for example, participate in a meaningful way when it comes to decisions that directly affect them? In my view, WSIS was the venue where these and related questions were addressed perhaps for the first time in a real comprehensive and perhaps almost systematic manner. Interestingly enough, not only governments argued about these questions, but also civil society. Also civil society groups held various views on how these problems should be approached and solved. Given the various concerns and interests involved in this field, it would have been probably very naive to expect the World Summit to sort out these issues and find consensual solutions for them. What the WSIS did in its wisdom was instead to choose procedural answers to these questions. It decided to form the Internet Governance Forum, and it also decided to start what is still quite vague today, a process towards enhanced cooperation. Both the forum and the so-called process towards enhanced cooperation do indicate that the WSIS participants regarded the current state of internet governance as not satisfying and in need of improvement. There are indeed a lot of unresolved practical as well as political problems that require collaborative solutions involving more than one government and also more than one stakeholder. The forum in particular is based on the assumption that new institutional formats combined with an open multi-stakeholder approach that encourages cooperation among all interested parties may help to approach these challenges both in an effective and legitimate way. It is these elements, this new institutional approach, that I especially like about the formation of the forum and that I found worth pointing out here in this context. So much about my background information and my appeal for support of the Internet Governance Forum. This afternoon we will turn to a bit more specific questions, namely the overarching goals of the Internet Governance Forum in the next 5 years. We might also address the question of priority issues, depending on the interests and questions of the audience. So let me now introduce our 3 speakers. First, we have Markus Kummer, Executive Coordinator of the Secretariat of the Internet Governance Forum. Before that, Markus was the head of the UN Working Group, the Secretariat of the UN Working Group on Internet Governance. He has been the ideal candidate for both of these positions because he had chaired the negotiating group that developed the agreed text on Internet governance for the WSIS Declaration of Principles and the Action Plan in late 2003. Then we have Martin Boyle. He is the head of Internet governance issues in the British Department of Trade and Industry. During the EU presidency of the UK, he was part of the team that negotiated on behalf of the EU in Tunis on WSIS. Martin is also the UK delegate to the Internet, to ICANN's Governmental Advisory Committee. And then we have Ken Cukier, who is journalist and I would say part-time academic. He is at present with The Economist, covering technology and telecommunication. Before that, he has been with various other distinguished papers, such as the Asian Wall Street Journal in Hong Kong, the Red Herring, and the International Herald Tribune in Paris. Between these positions, Ken was a research fellow at the National Center for Digital Government at Harvard University, John F. Kennedy School of Government. So we start with Markus. You have the floor.
Thank you, Jeanette, and good afternoon. I was also going to start with a flashback a bit to look at the history, but you said much of what I was going to say. Nevertheless, I think it may be useful to remind us that there are different subtexts in the whole debate on Internet governance. I would call it a geopolitical subtext, but also economic subtext, human rights subtext, and also a cultural subtext. And Jeanette rightly pointed out that one of the merits of WSIS was to come up with a definition of Internet governance that goes well beyond numbering and addressing. And looking at the background papers submitted to this event, I saw Don McLean had a very nice graphic illustrations of the definition of the forum. It was a kind of a fried egg that got bigger and bigger with slightly fuzzy edges, and that's where we are now with our understanding of Internet governance. The proposal to create this Internet Governance Forum, I think nobody can claim ownership to it. It was somewhat in the air. We discussed it at length in the Working Group on Internet Governance. It was sort of a result of our discussions that there was a general feeling there was a gap somewhere that needed to be filled, where we could create a place for informed and meaningful discussion on these issues, with the central element that this kind of discussion would have to take place in a multi-stakeholder context where all the actors could take part on an equal footing. that's where we are now. By now, I think the forum, the idea of the forum has been broadly welcomed, but based on the various positions, on the various subtexts, on the various agendas, there are widely differing expectations among various actors of what this forum should look like. And the negotiated texts, the Tunis Agenda for the Information Society, is a compromise. It's a diplomatic compromise, and is full. The beauty of it is it's full of creative ambiguity, which allowed everybody to find something that satisfied their own wishes and desires. And this is part of the challenges ahead of us. We have to find something to fill it with flesh and to reach compromises that more or less, I would say, we will not be able to fully satisfy all the expectations, but at least make everybody equally unhappy when we have our first meeting. Jeanette also rightly pointed out that this is new territory, uncharted territory. This kind of multi-stakeholder forum under a UN umbrella has not taken place before, and I think it's certainly relevant to look at it in the context of UN reform. In many other areas, the UN tries to open itself up to new actors. I think maybe the most advanced area may well be the health sector, where just due to necessity, governments realize they have to work also with health workers, with people at the grassroots, with pharmaceutical companies. Governments alone cannot solve HIV, AIDS. They need to work with other actors. Here, of course, the internet was somewhat different. Governments came in later. I mean, the internet was not created by governments. It was funded by one government, but governments did not want the internet. They did not ask for the internet, but then they discovered the power of the internet and the benefits of the internet, and they got interested. And now we have to find an equilibrium where we can allow each of these actors to have their own say. We have to develop our own procedures. Again, the Tunis Agenda, the negotiated text, gives us some guidelines. It's a heavy emphasis on the multi-stakeholder approach, but it does not exactly say how this should happen. It does not say, for instance, that the stakeholders should meet on an equal footing. This is clearly the understanding of the non-government actors, of private sector, civil society, the internet community, but there are governments which have another understanding of what this should look like, and we experienced that when we had our negotiations on how to go forward. Well, we have chosen an approach which is broadly based on what we used in the context of WIGIG when we had open consultations where all actors were allowed in and were allowed to participate on an equal footing, and this will also be the approach for Athens. So the positive reactions so far, of course, they don't hide the fact that underlying tensions are still there. We cannot gloss over the fact that there are major differences among major actors, countries and stakeholders. And this became also apparent in the first discussions on the agenda setting. There are, I would call it, two main approaches. One is more horizontal, or broad in its approach, whereas the other is more narrow and vertical. And the proposed agenda now for Athens is again a compromise between the two approaches. We will have sessions that are more open in their agenda, and then we have sessions that are devoted to four broad themes. But again, the compromise maybe is closer to those who wanted a broader approach. Now, the final program for Athens will be fleshed out, hopefully, next week when we have a meeting of the advisory group. But broadly speaking, there will be sessions devoted to the issues, the four broad issues of openness, access, diversity, and security. They will be underpinned by workshops that go more into the detail, and there will be also, we call it a plaza, a space for dialogue, where actors or also companies, private sector, civil society organizations can showcase their achievement and can share experiences. Now, these 4 broad themes I mentioned, I think it's generally recognized that these are important issues, but within each of them there are major differences and discrepancies. Openness, for instance, there's the issue of intellectual property rights, which can be very polarizing. Looking back at the history of WSIS, the text on intellectual property is a very carefully balanced text, but it is basically an agreement not to do anything, because I think negotiators were afraid to go too much into it because it's such a divisive and difficult issue. So it was just an attempt to find language where everybody could live with. Of course, it's understandable in a summit context, because a summit is supposed to be decision-making. But the forum now is different, and I think it will be difficult for the forum to avoid discussing issues related to intellectual property. Security is another issue, which is basically where everybody agrees that it's an important issue that needs to be addressed, but in this broad context, one issue that will cause controversy is privacy. Some can't have enough, and others would like not to discuss privacy. Multilingualism, there is the question of the internationalized domain names that causes where different players have different views whether or not this should be discussed or how deeply this should be discussed. And with regard to access, there I think is the old issue of interconnection costs, whether compensation should be paid versus liberalization as an answer to most of the problem, where the problem areas are. However, the step forward since WSIS, I would say, is that the second phase also clearly laid the responsibility on governments to have a multi-stakeholder dialogue at the national level on these issues. And I think this will also be a major step forward, that the problems are not just at the international level, but they have to be looked at the national levels. Let me conclude by trying to answer the 3 questions. What are the overarching goals? In my view, it should be to bring in developing countries in existing structures and give them a sense of ownership over internet governance institutions. And of course, Internet Governance itself, the Internet Governance Forum itself, should contribute to capacity building, which is one of the overarching goals of Internet governance for developments. With regard to the issues, there have been the same issues that have been mentioned since we began the consultative process, and they're also on the agenda of Athens meetings: spam, cybercrime, privacy, multilingualism, interconnection fees. But basically, in my view, the internet governance, any issue that allows to explore the complexity of internet governance mechanism and that showcases the need for a multi-stakeholder approach is a good issue for the Internet Governance Forum. It may be too early now to decide what is an issue that should be addressed in 4 or 5 years' time as issues come up and disappear. But I think the importance would be that the issues are significant enough to illustrate how the Internet and how the various mechanisms and arrangements work. And last but not least, how to participate? The answer is very easy. simply go to our website and register. We have a very open registration process, and also individual participants can register in their individual capacity as long as they have proven experience and expertise in internet governance issues. And there sometimes we have to ask back just to make sure that we know who people are who register. And we also hope to work on remote participation, so that those who cannot go to Athens can participate remotely. And why should you participate? Well, to learn from each other and to make your voice heard on these issues. The Internet Governance Forum will be a place to exchange experiences, to share best practices. It clearly does not have the remit to be a decision-making forum. Some disparagingly talk about a talking shop, but I take a different view. I think sharing best practices and exchanging experiences can be a very valuable exercise. And I see our friend Sam Poldridge from the OECD, from a distinguished organization which does, to a large extent, its activities on this basis, sharing best practices and exchanging experiences. And I think the OECD experience illustrate that this can be a very valid and valuable exercise. Thank you for your attention.
A little bit like both Jeanette and Markus, I also think, when thinking about what to say, I also thought it would be useful just to touch back on what I came out from WSIS with as being really the achievement of the process. And I think the real thing that struck me was that at the end of WSIS, the whole concept of a multi-stakeholder partnership and a multi-stakeholder framework had moved from being the unacceptable to really the basis for moving forwards. Yes, those people who went through the 2 rounds of WSIS will remember the battle of cultures. On the one side, people who are saying that governments are, of course, responsible for making the policy decisions. And at the other side of the spectrum, those people saying that stakeholders need to be fully engaged in the process. And neither side seeming to recognise that it is in fact possible to have something that melds both of those concepts. But what was particularly noteworthy, I think, was the shift from WSIS Phase 1, when stakeholders were shown the door with very little ceremony, and the second phase where there was a certain constructive ambiguity, whether that was just if we ignore the problem it will go away, but nevertheless that stakeholders had the opportunity to be present in the discussions and to help inform the discussions. And I think perhaps one of the key factors in making that change was WGIG. Because all of a sudden we found that it wasn't the evil empire that had come into the room, and it wasn't an end of civilization as we knew it, but rather that the dialogue moved to some new, quite interesting and quite constructive areas. So really it was a shift of mentalities, and partly, I think, by clever selection of governments of China, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Brazil, Iran, Russia in the working group, some of the countries that were most hostile to any sort of multi-stakeholder participation were there. Now, as Markus said, it's pretty obvious that the full concept of stakeholder dialogue has not been properly accepted by everybody. Well, certainly not yet. And that will stay for as long as people think that governments have got the magic wand, who are able to resolve problems that even long experience shows are not resolvable by waving a magic wand. Some people still think that that can be done. Where the UK sits certainly is that we recognise that we just can't approach the issues associated with the internet without being involved in dialogue, in discussion with the key stakeholders. And that if we were to, then we'd end up spending an awful long time writing legislation that would be completely unnecessary because people would start doing something different. You write the law and then people go off and do something different, and well, you were better off not wasting your time writing the law. And you can stifle innovation, you can stifle development of the market in so doing it. So what do you need to do? Well, you need to get the regulatory framework right. You need to look at how to get the benefits out to the citizens and users and businesses. And you need to see what and understand what's happening in the technology for the future, so that you get that framework right to get the most from the technologies. And you need to understand the social and personal issues as well. And governments are just not capable, cut out for being able to take all those issues and get it right. There is the need to understand directly from the stakeholders, and the way you do that is by hearing and understanding their issues. Now, having sort of done that and expressed the fact that multi-stakeholder cooperation was the big thing that came out of Tunis, and in internet governance, both of the mechanisms that were in the final Tunis agenda, enhanced cooperation and the Internet Governance Forum, are fundamentally this multi-stakeholder dialogue, multi-stakeholder cooperation, public-private partnerships, and right, okay, we've said what the principle is, now where do we take it from there? How do we develop those concepts? And these are not easy concepts, but they are concepts that people have got to start understanding and working towards developing, and not come at it thinking, hey, I've got the solution, because other people have got different approaches, different ideas. Privacy for one person is a real problem for somebody else, and therefore you've got to understand the ground on which you're trying to move. So, after that very long introduction, which was essentially my really saying that I do never like answering the exam questions, perhaps I ought to turn to the three questions that were set. And the first one, what are the overarching goals for the Internet Governance Forum in its 5-year lifespan? And I had lots and lots of very immature thoughts before I decided that perhaps what we were really after from the Internet Governance Forum was a very mature dialogue forum, discussion opportunity to show that multi-stakeholder dialogue works, so that the different stakeholders come away from Athens and think, hey, I learned something. I have something that I can take back home with me. And it's worth saving my money up so as I can go to the next one in Rio de Janeiro. And I think that's actually quite fundamental. It provides a discussion forum. And as Markus said, it's not a decision-making body. It's not supposed to be a decision-making body. It shouldn't even attempt to set itself up as a new regulatory body or as a forever intergovernmental organisation, please. But, as Markus said, if it comes up with people going away and saying, oh, I heard that, and that's a good thing to copy, or that is something I can do in the future, then that seems to me that the Internet Governance Forum can start thinking it's on the right, in the right direction. So what type of issues should the Internet Governance Forum address? Well, I won't try and reopen the ground. I know that the advisory group has laboured long and hard. But I think the sort of underlying point is to try and avoid, particularly for the first meeting, getting bogged down in the unresolvable, or at least not to end up with all of the topics on the agenda as being unresolvable. Somehow or other, the issues have got to be issues that are going to benefit from dialogue, from exchanging examples of best practice. And I think, actually, looking at the list, my only criticism of the list is it's incredibly long, and the topics are incredibly deep, and therefore managing time on a process like that is going to be very, very difficult. But the real thing is that people do see the benefit of raising those issues. And that if you can at least have one or two that give you a success, a win, because everybody goes along and says, well, actually, yes, we've got a good example of how to try and balance some of these issues together, then we might be able to move from, in United Nations terms, a successful Internet Governance Forum to an outstandingly successful Internet Governance Forum. How can people participate? Well, Markus has just told us, and that is really actually very important. I think that we do need to try and make sure that people have every single opportunity of getting in. The problem is that, of course, if everybody is speaking, nobody's listening, we've got to try and find some way of grouping the thoughts and getting the ideas out and allowing people to hear properly what is being said. Well, that seems to me to be pretty much like Mission Impossible. The only thing I can say is that, well, jolly good luck to you, but I'm sure that getting moderators in to help run lists and do some of that grouping, looking at journalists to try and help you, looking at academics to try and help you distill some of the key features, I think would actually be quite helpful. But the key bit is how to get to a wider audience. That is, I think, where the importance of the press really comes in. The press is important in its own right. It's one of the stakeholders. You know, it's a user of the internet. It's a participant per se. But it's also got another role. And I think it's something that we should be looking at very carefully. Everybody should be looking at very carefully. How do you try and get the messages out so that the discussion isn't just the same gang who were there in Geneva in 2000 and whenever it was, 3, and in Tunis in 2005? Because if you do that, I don't think it's really the success we should hope for. Why should, because I thought there were 4 questions here, why should somebody take part? Well, here's an opportunity to show that it is actually possible to have a good and serious discussion between stakeholders on some very, very important issues. Yeah, these are the issues that my minister gets letters about. And if my minister gets letters about, I get worried because I have to write the bloody answers. So that, and we haven't got the answers. And so somehow or other, trying to get some better understanding of these issues, I think, is actually sort of quite key. And that is an opportunity for people to get involved. Second point, well, because if you, the non-governmental people, don't, somehow or other you're missing an opportunity to educate the people who would want to be your masters. And that, again, is actually so quite important because people like me, I don't understand the internet. I'm a civil servant, for heaven's sake. Civil servants, well, I didn't study history, but most of them just studied history in the UK. And this is actually an opportunity for trying to get those issues much better understood within the governments. Because, my third reason is because it gives you a real opportunity to actually understand some of the other issues that other people have. It's very easy to think, this is the right way to do it, because we've always done it this way. And then when you hear from somebody else, they've actually found a neat little way that has done something that has actually helped benefit their citizens, or whatever. If everybody goes away from the IGF thinking, that is actually something I could do, or that I could contribute to, then I think, again, we're looking at a success. I'm realising that I've now reached the end of my time, so I'll just make one last point and miss the other ones on my list. And that is really because all the other ways of addressing important international internet issues are actually so much worse. So make it work. Thank you.
I've actually, when you're not certain of what the answer is, the best thing to do is act like a smart Jesuit and ask another question. Or, in the case of a journalist, actually disregard the question altogether and actually come up with what you actually would otherwise want to say. Kissinger once started a press conference looking at the press corps and asked them, in Kissingerian fashion, who here has the question for the answers I want to give? So first, thank you to Jeanette, to John Palfrey, to Bill Dutton at the OII and at the Berkman Center. And thank you for all of you being here today. It's 1996. It's August. Excuse me. It's September. It's 1996. It's exactly 10 years ago today. And the people of internet governance are crowded around, the people who actually make all the decisions, and the people who actually are the most important people who actually manage internet governance. And where are they in September of 1996? Anyone remember? Anyone know? Sam? Partridge? Ah, they were there in July. We're not quite there yet. It's true. They're in Cambridge, Massachusetts, actually. They're not at the Berkman Center. It doesn't exist yet. They're at the Kennedy School of Government, the Harvard Information Infrastructure Project. It sounds so robust. And Tony Rutkowski is there. People, I could give you the names. I'm not going to bother because the reason why is probably you don't know them. It's an entirely different cast of characters. Before that September, that incredible September meeting, in which one person called the DNS terrorist surprised everyone by walking in. This was the person, his name was Eugene Kasparov, and he's the person who was who actually was creating what was called eDNS, or alternative domain names, and he was selling them. There was one other person named Chris Ambler, who wasn't at the meeting, who was basically taking registrations under .web, which still doesn't exist. But the point here is that as the old guard of Scott Bradner and Dave Clark and John Postel, I believe, was there, but I'm not certain if he was discussing what do we do about internationalizing and privatizing internet governance,
in walks the person that on the mailing list, and the big boogeyman at the time. It wasn't NSI, that would come within a month. It was indeed Eugene Kasparov, the DNS terrorist, who was trying to break and fracture the internet by commercializing the domain name space. Now, of course, by the benefit of hindsight, we could see that it didn't actually take one individual to do that. You could take one monopoly company and do that, called VeriSign, and create such huge problems, because as ICANN had to take a strong regulatory hand towards VeriSign, it was obliged to take it to be even-handed, and therefore take a strong regulatory hand with all other things as well. And of course, even as it tried to manage this in a centralized way, where the internet had formerly been decentralized, it created other problems, and the question of legitimacy came up, why one government managed it, et cetera. And of course, that fury turned into what eventually became the WSIS process. I mention all of this history because I think it's important to think about where the internet was 10 years ago, helps us here today in the present, because it obliges us to think about where it might be 10 years from now. So, it's September, maybe it's August 2016, and we're in Oxford. Well, the first question is, we probably won't be in Oxford. Where will we be? OII and the Berkman Center will have links with Shanghai University, or maybe we don't even think about China's coasts anymore with Shanghai and Beijing. It's going to be some unpronounceable name deep in the center of the country, because economic growth has gone there as well. And actually, for many years now, the Internet Governance meeting will be held there. It's going to be held in many different languages, because I'm not going to learn Chinese, and you're not either. Where everyone is resource constrained in this world, and so we have problems, but of course we will have our little earpieces on. It won't look like the UN, because of course this is an academic setting, and we're going to have to discuss, what are we going to have to discuss? Will it be a sign of progress if we're discussing internet governance in 10 years, to show that there's a flourishing democracy in which we're all discussing these same issues, part of a timeless conversation of how we order our lives? Or will it be a sign of despairing problems, that we actually haven't sorted out these problems today, which we could have otherwise sorted out? Now, I'm not certain if one answer or the other answer is correct, but I think that is the questions that we have to ask when we think about what the internet governance mechanisms will be in 10 years' time. The one thing that we're certain that we don't know is what the internet will look like in 10 years' time. Now, a year ago, David Clark of MIT, in the video conference in our private meeting, gave us one small vision. Amid a longer discussion, he said he expected sensors, billions of sensors, to be on the internet. He even used an image I liked. He said, kids are going to be buying them like stickers, or as if putting money in a gumball machine and get them out, and they'll be putting them on lampposts.
These are sensors with an S, not a C, right?
Yes, exactly. They're sensors with an S. Good point. Thank you. Yeah. Well, actually, Clark is very optimistic in my most dyspeptic kind of approach. As a journalist, I can imagine a sensor with a C, and you're going to have sensors everywhere and on the lamppost. But that's going to be a clash of Dave Clark and my visions, and hopefully it'll swing towards David's. So what will the network look like when we have billions of devices on it, all carrying traffic in real time and sensors? Will it look like the internet of today? Well, probably not. Can we scale the internet of today to what it looks like in tomorrow? Probably not, unless we do some changes. So how do we make these changes? Because we kind of like the internet today, and we don't really know what we're going to do. And of course, we have a huge clash. Where we try to make any changes on the internet today, we actually see problems. For example, if we knock on the door of the domain name system and we try to do something different in terms of how we order the institutional mechanism, people say that's a bad idea. Don't do that. Whatever you do, don't do that. On the same time, if we knock on the door of the economic model of the internet and try to make changes to that, for example, network neutrality, the end-to-end principle, people say, no, absolutely, don't do that at all costs. That's the worst thing that we could possibly do. And in fact, someone who came from planet Mars and or saw the internet and wasn't imbued in either side, maybe someone who was neutral, paid to be neutral, a journalist, would look at these issues and say, this is very peculiar. The people who are the radical revolutionaries, the internet pioneers, are now looking extremely conservative. And these other people, well, they may not have the best interests of the network at heart. Governments just might want to control it because they feel that that's just what they do. At the same time, businesses might just want to exploit it because they're trying to be profit maximizing on the firm level and not on the industry level, when in fact the internet was created by academia and government precisely because it actually could try to make a significant innovative shift at the industry level and not the singular firm level. Those singular firms like AT&T and Digital Equipment Corp that did try to do that with their own proprietary protocols, of course, have gone by the wayside of the internet. Nevertheless, even if we want to hold their motives as suspect and put it aside, it's still an interesting paradox that the revolutionaries are now the conservatives. They're now the revanchists. So this is all my introduction, even though I have 5 minutes left. And what I'm going to do with my remaining 5 minutes is just say 3 very simple points, and then try to explain one small problem, and then give you one small conclusion as far as I see it. I can do it in 3 minutes. I came late, so I want extra time. The first point, they're very, very simple points. So very simple that I almost feel foolish to actually say it, but I will actually try to say it because I think by reiterating the obvious, it helps us focus the mind on very basic things. The first has already been said, but I want to echo it, which is ICANN is not internet governance. When we started this process, that wasn't so clear. Part of the reason is because internet governance was really always just a shorthand. It was always just a code word. The media loved the term internet governance, and frankly, I work as a journalist. You try to explain the whole ICANN, John Postel stuff, and really to be precise. And frankly, in 250 words, you can't. So ICANN becomes the domain name regulator, the .web addresses, right? And internet governance just has to be used to mean this basket of different things. But of course, it isn't that. The big surprise, I think, during the WSIS process was when the West, mainly America and Europe, were listening in those rare moments when they listened to what the rest of the world were saying, and they realized actually the issues that were being brought up were issues about the digital divide, the issues about the importance of open source software, issues of privacy. One of the most important issues, I believe, was the question of international domain names. And the reason why was because when the rest of the world saw internet governance, they didn't just see the ICANN issue. It was one important factor, but it wasn't the only one. So of course, the implication is that we need to think far broader about these issues than we do when we actually go into this process. The second point, which is also blindingly obvious, but needs to be stated again, is that the web is not the internet, and the internet is not the World Wide Web. In almost all of the decisions we're making today, we actually either confuse the two, or we presume that the internet that we have today will look like the internet that we will have tomorrow. But the one thing that we know, ironically, about the internet is that it's always changing. And it's never the same river twice. So why would we actually be talking about domain names, thinking that we're talking about identifying machines online, instead of identifying 100,000 different parts on a single airplane, and every single airplane that flies now has its own part measured or monitored in real time with its traffic going on. The majority just as the majority of phone calls now internationally are over voice over IP links and not over circuit switch links, the day is going to come very soon in which machines talking to other machines, unprompted automatically, supersedes communications between human beings to another human being, which of course is the majority of traffic today. I instigate a YouTube video by clicking on a link. But that is not going to be the majority of traffic in the world, in the future, in this internet that we can't even imagine, but can get small glimpses of through sages like David Clark. And of course, the implication there is that we need to prepare for a multiplicity of applications and things and ways that people are working on the internet, and we're not quite certain how to scale it. But if there's a problem, and then there's the third point, which again is very simple, is what you see is what you see. Now, we're used to a world in which what you see is what you get, right? And that makes sense. So if you see, for example, that commercial relationships are the most important thing and that the private sector needs to manage resources, you get privately held top-level domains that are managed by a single company. Or if you see everyone speaking English and you're speaking English and that's all you're doing, what you get is the ASCII code for the domain name system and an inflexibility from changing that. And we're used to this. What you see is what you get. If what you see is governments as the center of the society that you're in, what you get is an approach that favors a governmental outcome for how you manage, say, technological resources. But really, when you think about it, what you see is what you see. It's what you see, maybe not others, and it's only what you see. It's maybe not what is. And I think the problem of internet governance has been that people have seen lots of things, but other people see it differently. And maybe it's not what it is. And there's this feeling, the presumption that by talking and dialogue, we will actually come to some sort of agreement. As Markus Kummer has long said throughout this process, this is an educational process. And of course, what he doesn't say, of course, is who is educating whom. But the irony is that there may not be a consensus. In fact, through this educational process, we may just agree that we actually totally disagree and we actually can't find an agreement in these things. To me, the ultimate problem, therefore, is that the way that we consider the internet is actually changing, and it's actually kind of becoming hardened and fastened into place. That it actually is losing its capacity for innovation. That even the people who first promulgated the internet and gave it this rich diversity, this kind of singularity of a network that allowed all other networks to interconnect to it, that's why it's an internet, an interconnected network. Now the attempt is doing their very best to kind of singularize it again, to keep it one single thing and make sure it doesn't change. And so it strikes me that the single problem for the internet is that inelasticity of approaches, that inability to evolve in different ways. And so the central challenge is how to accommodate those differences on the internet. Now, I don't have a good answer, but I have a bad answer. It's part of your pack of contributions of position papers. And I'll let you read it and fall asleep tonight, quicker than you would if you read The Economist and fell asleep. In short, it basically says we should somehow try to codify what the internet is, sort of define it in a way, and all the values that we like about it and the good attributes of it, but do so in a way that presumes that it's not going to be the only thing we have. So we have the ICANN legacy root system because it's very useful, it serves our needs, Disney likes it, etc. But we can also have alternative navigational approaches. We like end-to-end as a principle, so we want to enshrine that. We probably don't want to do that in law, but we want to enshrine that somehow definitionally. But we also want to allow people to deploy networks as they'd like to do otherwise. Who are we to presume that we know best, right? And the way that I propose doing that is through trademark law. Trademarking the internet, and people can sell it, and if you're interfering with network neutrality, therefore you can't sell the internet service. With that, I want to thank my distinguished co-panelists because they, as is always the case when you're speaking last, came up with all the good stuff and left me with the dregs. And thank you for paying attention.
I consider myself the first of several respondents. I hope this is meant to be a discussion, so I will not go on for long, but just wanted to give a few reactions. I'm one of the Johnny-come-latelys to this. As Ken pointed out, I am one of the people who was not there in 1996. Of course, being 12 years old at the time had something to do with it. But I have followed this process through what Ken and Kieran and others have written about this over the course of that decade, and am struck by the value of history, actually, the way that Ken told it, the notion that perhaps Martin civil servants are historians, but there seems to be some lessons to dredge up over that period of time and to look ahead. So here's what I heard, and I will then sort of leave it there and then hopefully have others with better reflections. But I heard sort of two big clumps of things. One is, what is the Internet Governance Forum? Particularly the first couple of speakers spent a fair amount of time recounting what had happened recently, which I think is extremely helpful. What I heard is it is something we feel good about as a group, that the outcome was a positive one from the WSIS process. I mean that seriously and not entirely jokingly. It is a new institutional approach. That was, I think, Jeanette's term. It is uncharted territory under a UN umbrella. I liked the reference to the fact that we might have something here that would be a model for UN reform, or at least relevant to the discussion of UN reform from Markus. That may have been the most provocative thing I've ever heard the distinguished diplomat from Switzerland ever to say in a context like this. It is a place for informed and meaningful discussion, strikes me as a good thing as well. It is a place that values a multi-stakeholder context and framework. I liked Martin's historical note over the course of the WSIS process that went from a complicating, sort of difficult conversation to one that, of course, that's the basis of this process. I think there's still issues to be worked out, of course, in the nature of participation, but the notion of multi-stakeholder involvement being a key one, of course, and a certain sense of openness in the process. Obviously, people can watch this webcast. I hope people are, more than one or two, and there are ways of doing this in the process going forward, and I see that as sort of pointing to some of the challenges embedded in what Markus has to do. I heard it is modeled in a way on the OECD. Now, it wasn't said exactly, but the notion that the OECD has been successful in using the approach of sharing experiences and sharing best practices as a means of making a difference. Not, of course, a literal model, and of course there are reasons why this is broader in scope and many ways from OECD, but that you can actually get to results by virtue of something that is about sharing experiences and best practices. And most, I think, alluring in a way, it is about creative ambiguity in its definition and in its promise. I'm sure there are other people who heard different things of what is the Internet Governance Forum, but to me that set of 6 or 8 statements actually is, in a way, the most compelling description that I've ever heard of what is the Internet Governance Forum and where we're headed. The second kind of chunk of things I heard was embedded in all of this. What are the hard problems that we're going to face in the IGF looking ahead? And I very much like Ken's framework of where will we be in 2016. Martin's framework of what would an outstanding success look like, not just a regular old success that Markus has already pulled off, but how do we go to that next level beyond sort of just creating a process that we feel good about. It strikes me there are 3 really sort of sticky problems there from what you guys said. First is, how do you deal with hard issues? How do you take on the creative ambiguity and do something useful with it? The second is, how do you make participation meaningful in this process? It may be open, but what does that then mean? And then third, how do you connect it to results? How do you get this to be more than just a talk shop, to take seriously the critique that Markus raised initially? So backing up to these 3 in brief. So one is dealing with hard issues. Markus kind of ticked down the 4 key topics, some of which we'll be doing work on in an academic setting moving forward. But within openness, he noted IPR. So obviously one of the big elephants in the room through the process was intellectual property rights and the fact that we're never going to agree that the United States approach is right or the Western approach is right and others aren't. And so we're going to agree to disagree and put that in there. And so how do you deal with that when it comes back up? And it's going to come back up. I think that's helpful. I would add another one in openness. The only thing that this is where being the respondent, I can be snarky, right? And this is Britain, and I can be really direct about it. There was a discussion of the extent to which WSIS 1 was about involving people, not involving necessarily other stakeholders, and they were sort of shown the door unceremoniously, but then in Tunis that there was sort of more open and more involving other stakeholders. In Tunis, the thing that struck me most as sort of ironic about the whole thing was if you wanted to talk about freedom of expression, though, you had a really hard time of doing it. One of our panels, with Hivos and others, was shown the door, quite literally, and quite unceremoniously. And when you were in Tunis, throughout much of the state, you couldn't access a whole lot of the internet, which we tested in real time and we all experienced, and most of what you couldn't experience were things that were critical about the state or about the process. And so I think there was something in there that said, yes, we're bringing people in, but there's still a really hard problem there related to different views of freedom of speech and freedom of access to bits of the internet. That's my hobby horse, so I admit that I'm on my hobby horse as one of the people studying it through the OpenNet initiative, but I do think that's that's buried there in a very hard openness problem. Within security, I heard privacy as sort of being the bugbear. I would add surveillance, again, with the Open Net Initiative hat. If you're thinking about, obviously, some of the places that were ticked off, like China and Saudi Arabia, there are quite different views of filtering and surveillance than there are in Western states, extremely different. We also think there are now 36 states that are doing filtering and surveillance. How do you deal with that if 36 out of 200 states in the world are doing this and in lots of different ways? I think that's something that's going to be an issue. Within the multilingualism, of course, the IDN discussion, within access, the interconnection issue, and as sort of a further point, I take Ken's ultimate point in some ways, maybe of his second point is, let's pay attention to the issues that we don't yet know about, but we know are coming down the pike because the internet changes so fast. And so how do you structure a discussion forum or a hopefully results-oriented forum that's flexible enough to take on issues that, that we'll derive later? Okay, so that's sort of how do you deal with hard problems. Second is how do you make participation meaningful? Again, I think that the example of ICANN, something that Milton Mueller and Ken and many others have studied in great detail, is a helpful one. I think there's a whole lot of administrative law scholarship, to put it in American terms, but around the world as in, if you are not formally a member of the process, how do you speak? And then much more importantly, how do you ensure that people are in fact listening? And I loved the idea that Martin put out about how could you maybe cluster the commentary that comes in some ways and make it so that it's not astroturf comments, but it's rather a way to take input that's meaningful from people and then to filter that in to the conversation and ensure that there's actually a dialogue there. And the flip side of that, which is then how do you reach a wider audience? How do you connect with the press, with the Kens and Kierans and others who actually are covering this and struggling with putting this topic into 250 or 300 words and then bring other people into the process. My colleague Mary Rundle has been working on a net dialogue project that has been very much focused on this. We've spent a lot of time thinking about how to use new technologies to accomplish this, but I think there's a real problem and a huge opportunity there in terms of making participation meaningful. And then lastly, I think the hardest thing, of course, is how do you connect this to results? Nobody is saying that the IGF is a regulatory body. Okay, got that. Nobody is saying, in fact, that we are going to be doing it the way ICANN did. Nobody is saying we're going to be doing this in the way that something has gone before. I'd slightly pull back from my OECD model comment in the sense it's not actually looking to what some other body has done in terms of the connection to results, but rather trying to take on something new over 5 years or 10 years and getting beyond being a talk shop. And it seems like it is entirely possible to say we're not going to make decisions, but we are hoping to make a difference ultimately, and not just because people had the opportunity to talk about it. And what is that kind of a difference that this time and effort that everybody here, as well as the forum itself, is participating in? So on that note, I'd love to thank the panel and to turn it over to the real panel.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Wolfgang, yes, please, go ahead.
Yes, I was impressed by Kenneth's observation that the revolutionaries of yesterday are the conservatives of today. And you know what we should do with this. But looking back to all the revolutions in the last 200 or 300 years, I think this is very normal. People have a revolutionary idea, then they implement it, and then they try to protect the basic idea while life is going on. And the exciting question, if we look towards 2016, is where are the revolutionaries of today? And this is the important question. So we have what we got from the revolutions of yesterday, but we have to move forward. And this is unknown. And I think the forum is a great opportunity really to push and to pull out some fresh ideas. And to get out some fresh ideas, I fully support what has been said here, that we need fresh blood, we need new constituencies, new groups. Because otherwise, the forum will repeat the battles of yesterday. So because you have the clear fronts, and you know the arguments of all sides, from the battles from yesterday, but we have to face indeed the battles of tomorrow. And this is my question to you, the other panelists. Looking towards 2016, what are the revolutions, or which kind of revolution we need today, by keeping what we have, but moving forward and creating new opportunities and creating new spaces, which will help us, to make more benefit than we have today. Because as somebody has said, there is a great risk that 2016 will be more restrictions, will be censorship, will be, millions of gatekeepers or censors, as you have said. So this is the worst case scenario, but as an optimist, I always think we will have a brilliant future. So, and what are the revolutions we need today to have this brilliant future? This is my question.
This might actually be an interesting exercise to search the forum for potential revolutionaries, right? We have 4 days to find them, to locate them. Yes, please. Would you perhaps introduce yourself?
My name is John Dixon. I work in a group called Cabbage Research Group, and I won't bore you with any stage there. I wanted to raise this question, the revolutionaries or the conservatives, and say, no, that isn't true. The revolutionaries were revolutionary, and I was one of them, in the collaborative multi-stakeholder methodology, which you're all talking about, which enabled the controlled growth of the internet in the first place. And the reason they're being conservative, like I am, is we don't want other people to come along, look at what we've done and say, hey, that's great, we'll take it over, and now we're going to control it by some other methodology. And there was a slogan around at the time, which arose from the avowed intention of Microsoft to corrupt the internet protocols so that they could get a commercial lock in them. And our slogan was, they stole our internet and we're going to take it back. And in order to prevent that conflict carrying on, anybody who proposes to set up this internet government forum has got to engage with my community, and you're not doing that.
Okay. So we have here a counterposition to what Wolfgang Kleinwächter just said. It's not that we need new revolutionaries, but the revolutionary internet might die if we don't preserve it the way it was originally designed. Now, do our speakers want to respond to this, these comments, or are we collecting more questions? Are there more comments or questions? Otherwise, yes, please. Introduce yourself, perhaps, first.
My name's Michael Eaton, and I'm the director of something called E-Wales, which is a Welsh Assembly government activity. And like my colleague, I'm a civil servant, but by profession I've been in the IT industry for 20 years. One thing that strikes me very much about this area and this topic is the use of the term internet versus a lot of the thing that's been talked about, which is the applications which happen to run over it. And is the danger of declaring this as, this is what the internet means, in fact, one of the fundamental sticking points, because the scope is just going to creep everywhere, so you will never achieve anything. So my comment is, if you mean the internet, not the raft of applications which happen to travel over it, then that's what you should be talking about. Because otherwise, you will never, ever, ever achieve any kind of sustainable objective, because the scope is just too vast.
Are you addressing this advice to the forum or to us discussing the fate, the future development of the internet?
It struck me that the scope of what's being attempted to be discussed, debated, and reach conclusion on is too vast a topic to get conclusions reached on if you're looking at a global issue. And Kenneth actually said something very clear, which actually harks back to the beginning. And the thing is, the internet was the Yeah, a network of networks. It was a network of networks that carried data. That's what it did. But at the same time, there was also a network of networks that carried voice. The evolution of the global voice network and the agreements required to keep it running and to deal with security and privacy was because it was very much there to support one application type. The internet, if you debated it as just carrying data, you would be able to control the scope creep because it conveys multiple applications and therefore multiple economic value chains and technology value chains. I think that is the problem that you've set yourself accidentally, which is you are not hiding to nothing, and in 5 years' time, if that's the lifetime, you will be looking back and saying, we opened all these questions and we actually never closed one down.
Okay, what we heard now is the advice to rather focus on applications than on the internet infrastructure. Before I give you the floor, Martin, I'd like to take one last question by Desiree Milosevic.
Thank you. It's more of a brief comment as well, and I certainly have questions. The comment was a reaction to the speaker just before me, what he said. I just wanted to mention to the group that the beauty of IP protocol is that it decouples the application from the transit. So if you just look at the application level, it's not the whole of the internet to look at. So I think that's an important clarification to understand how the system works and not to focus on just one issue.
So Desiree thinks we need to look at both the IP infrastructure and the applications. Bill, you also want to address this issue.
If you're still collecting questions, just if I could slide one quick question in, which is, in all the presentations, I didn't hear a research question. That is there anything that you need from academia that, with respect to research? Is this purely a political matter, or is it something that research could inform in some way, other than maybe helping to do a journalistic synthesis of the discussion? Is there a research problem or a question that could help?
So Bill Dutton asks, the researcher asks what he should do research about, and he addresses this question to our panelists. So I think you have now enough food for answers. Please keep it quick so that we can perhaps have another round of questions. Martin, you would like to start?
Yeah, I'd like actually to pick up on the whole concept of really think what are the social implications of the internet, because when the dialogue actually starts and the issues that sit on the list for the Internet Governance Forum, an awful lot of those are actually issues that exist in geographical space and not just in internet space or on cyberspace. And this, I think, is, I got the message from quite a number of the people who were speaking, that this is something that is giving people cause for concern. We are expected to sort out problems in cyberspace that we haven't been able to resolve in real space at all. Or that, we've resolved, we've passed laws, but people still go and suppress freedom of expression, or invade people's privacy, or steal IPR, or commit frauds, and so on and so forth. And they do that in the real world. So I think that's something we actually always need to bear in mind, that an awful lot of the discussion that I heard in the WSIS negotiations was actually very much more about social issues and political issues than it was about really the internet. It's just the internet makes these things easier and faster to do. And therefore, I'd like to actually then answer Bill's question about, is there really any future for him? And I actually go back to one part of my career. I was secretary to a foresight panel, and one of the things that people said then, and this was in 1995, was that, well, actually, we don't know how this stuff, the cyber world, is really going to impact on sort of those wider social implications. The idea of the sensors with an S that are now on all the lampposts, what does that mean for privacy when anybody anywhere can start accessing it? That question was asked in 1995. And as far as I'm aware, in 2006, we haven't really gone through from an academic sort of basis and pulled together the social, the political, all the sort of technical change ideas, put them together and sort of started to try and understand what are the real things that we should be being worried about beyond the things that we are normally worried about in normal everyday life. Thank you.
Markus or Ken?
There was a lot of comments. Let me take one or two of them in brief. First, to Wolfgang's point about perhaps the forum can serve as a good purpose to identify these revolutionaries, kind of put capes on them so that they can fly across buildings in a single bound. That's disparaging. I don't mean to say that, but it's to say that by definition, the revolutionaries are not in the room. They're setting off their revolutions. And so the point of the forum is inherently reactive, that the best public policy can do is not to try to anticipate the future, but to let it happen. That, I think, is how we should think about the relationship between the forum and the revolutionaries that we see. To the second gentleman's point, saying that in fact the revolutionaries weren't really conservative. The revolution was basically about a collaborative process that needs to be preserved, and if you lose it, you actually lose the internet itself. I paraphrase violently, and I apologize. I agree with that. In fact, the internet the internet engineers, I was actually, in preparing, believe it or not, I did prepare for my remarks today, I was reading some of the earlier documents from around 92, because I was looking at historical stuff, and around 96. I was looking particularly at some of the earlier debates over peering, how networks interconnect. And I was looking at, in 91, you'd be interested to know that there was a period in which two networks after the NSF backbone privatized, where they didn't actually interconnect and there was no traffic exchange. That was a serious problem. Imagine on the internet, you try to send an email, you don't get it. So this unitary internet that we didn't always have to such a degree. There was an acceptable use policy. No commercial traffic could go over the internet. I mean, so it's changed a lot. And in looking at that, I realized that reading the earliest writings of the people like David Clark, Scott Bradner, John Postel, they all actually acknowledged, they didn't say they were conservative. They didn't use that term. They were referring to it as coherence, that they're trying to create a coherence about how, but they recognized that they were creating a stability, and that stability was gelling in place something, but it was for other values. So although I agree with you, in fact, I agree with your point to such a degree, that's why I think that the only way to accommodate both this stability for what the internet is, as well as change that we can't anticipate, even if it's going to harm that stability, is, well, that the problem is to actually accommodate both, to reconcile this inherent tension. And one bad solution is trademark law, to actually codify what is the internet while allowing other things to flourish, because you could actually define it and you could slap people on the wrist, ISPs, if they don't really do the I part, but are really network service providers, because they're actually, say, undermining network neutrality. As to Bill's question on research, it strikes me that the interesting thing would be a political science question, but it wouldn't be structured in a methodology that a researcher would feel comfortable with. It would be more like what de Tocqueville would have felt comfortable with, or Auguste Comte, and that is to say, if you think about what the problem of internet governance is, kind of the fear, is that a party will actually deviate from what the internet is today and will do something different. So what you'd want is a political science question, which is, what would it take so that any party that was upset with any decision that was made would still have an incentive to remain inside the system and work within its rules rather than deviate and do something different? So for example, why is it that when the Democratic Party loses power in the US, it doesn't call up its own troops and shoot George W.? Today, of course, in Washington's climate, that probably would be possible, but in 2000 and 2004, it didn't happen. And the reason why, of course, is that there's a natural ebb and flow in the political system. They understand there's more incentives to work within the system than to overthrow it. So the question is, on one hand, checks and balances. How can we institutionalize internet governance so that there's actually a mechanism of checks and balances so that we can feel happy that absolute power can corrupt absolutely, yet we can still see that it's not going to be, it's not going to, even though we know that would be the natural tendency. On the other hand, you'd want to have factions, you'd want to have parties. And the research question, if you will, would be, how could you actually organize this great mass of interest into party affiliations or factions so that you could actually see perspectives come in and come out, and in terms of how to manage the network, yet at least some sort of core basic principles of what the internet is preserved within that system.
Just a few remarks. I also listened with great sympathy to the comments by a gentleman, John Dixon, I think, wrote down, yes, that the founding fathers of the internet obviously want to preserve what they think is good of the internet and what we think is good of the internet. And also his comments that we need to engage, and we have not done that enough. I would just maybe like to recall, looking back at the history again, right to begin with, and Martin pointed this out, governments were among themselves in the first phase in Tunis, and we have come a long way from there. And I felt the internet community began to engage. Professionals dealing with the internet were part of the process, and I hope this will increase and be more so. And we hope also to have the two inventors of the TCP/IP addressing the meeting in Athens, and I think it will be an important gesture to show that we actually pay tribute to those who invented the internet and gave it to us. The last comment on the danger of scope creep. Yes, indeed, our agenda is very broad as it is, but then again, it goes also to the nature of the forum. You said if you open all these questions, we may not be able to close any of them, but this is actually a fundamental question, whether the forum is here to close any question. And I think also John Palfrey asked the question, what will be the relationship, or what is the measure, the yardstick for success of the forum? And I think we're struggling still around with this, but the forum will be the town hall meeting where everybody gets together, but it will not necessarily be the place where the questions are solved or where the questions are closed. But what we termed in the advisory group, there may be dynamic coalitions emerging from the forum who address certain questions or who agree to work together to try to look into a question. And there, I think, is also the outreach to the academic and scientific community. They're very much part of this, and their input, I think, is not only welcome, it will be needed when we move forward from Athens to the Rio, and I think it's India already is announced for the year after.
Thank you. Are there more questions?
I'm going to respect the desires of Bill and the chair and rattle off questions, quick questions. Number one, for Ken, who owns this trademark you're talking about and how does it get enforced? For Markus, when we talk about the town hall meeting, town halls are typically associated with governments which had some kind of political status, let's say. We won't use the power word, we'll just say status. So what is the incentive of the global public to come to this global town hall if there's no political dimension to what they're doing? And the third question is, picking up on this gentleman's point, do you see a danger, I guess this is for Markus also, but Martin could address it also, do you see a danger that the concept of internet governance gets completely confused with ICT governance, and that thereby we become so diffuse in our attention that we really cannot accomplish anything?
Okay, now.
Okay. Richard Collins, I'm Professor of Media Studies at the Open University in the UK. My question chimes to some extent with some of the things that Milton has brought out. And I'll begin by putting it in a possibly over-cynical way. Is the IGF going to do anything, or does it exist for itself? And less cynically, an American political philosopher, Nancy Fraser, has talked about modern politics increasingly being about problems of recognition as well as more classical ones of redistribution. And some of the things that Markus and Martin said about the successes of WSIS and WSIS seem to be successes of recognition. There are references to the inclusion of new groups of stakeholders. Martin talked about the way in which the involvement of countries like Iran, Brazil, Russia in the proceedings took a lot of the sting out of some conflicts. So is IGF about providing mechanisms for recognition? Or is it about, to use a word that Milton invoked, is it about power, a redistribution of power? Is it actually going to make a difference to the internet?
Thank you.
Patricia Drakes. Just one really observation of words from tonight. In taking the unexpected, I think perhaps the whole area of security can bring some basic unexpecteds. And as one example, pre-internet times, secure information, our social security numbers, our personal details and bank information would be kept in locked spaces in rooms and only having restricted access. The fact that now it can appear on the full sticks or external drives, just as an example, being left anywhere, I think there are some basic things that are now new issues of expecting the unexpected, that are having quite a big impact. And for example, with payment card industry standards, we're making sure that suppliers who use machines do it in the right way. And I think that is one of the new unexpected aspects, which is really a security thing, which maybe hasn't or hasn't feed into getting things out.
Thank you. There was one last question.
Yeah, just quickly, James Driver from Open Strategies. I just wanted to ask a bit more information about the plans to sort of make this participation in this process meaningful in a multi-stakeholder context. Specifically, how it's going to address the issues of whether or not the stakeholders are seen as equals. It seems there's some uncertainty about that. And finding an approach which recognises that the views of each of the stakeholders are equal, but their ability to implement ideas are not necessarily equal. And secondly, making participation meaningful through clearly showing how people's views are actually linking to results. And I think Kenneth mentioned that there's probably not going to be any consensus on a lot of the issues that are raised. So how is it possible to still link through to results despite the lack of consensus, and whether or not there's ways in which there can be consensus among subgroups that will still allow people's participation to clearly link to results?
Thank you.
Well, I think most questions either addressed to me directly or that come up turn around the nature and the character of the IGF, and I think the mandate will not allow it to solve problems of redistributions, but if it can help to address and to solve problems of recognition, then I would think then it has already achieved something. And well, Milton asked a related question. Maybe town hall was not the right word for this. Maybe it should be a speaker's corner rather than town hall. But again, we are at early stages, and I think expectations, it's also a question of expectation management. If you go to Athens and you think you're going to change the world, and then you go out of Athens and nothing has changed, then obviously you will be disappointed. But if you go to Athens with the expectation of having an interesting meeting, of meeting interesting people, of hearing interesting speakers and sharing exchange of information, and you go, I think Martin made his point right at the beginning, that you come out and have the feeling you learned something, you had meaningful discussions, you are also able to contribute something to an international discussion and awareness raising, then I think the Athens meeting will achieve something. But the overall, I think we have to give it also time and look at it, and after 5 years lifespan we have to look back and see, has it achieved anything, if at all. But I think at this stage it will be too early, too ambitious, I think, to set the expectations too high.
Okay, thank you, Markus. Please, Ken, 1.5 minutes.
Sorry.
Can I cede my time to Martin and then give 30 seconds at the end?
No. I don't negotiate the order. You want the last word, you don't get it.
Oh my God. Actually, this puts me in a very uncomfortable position. I'm going to have to take out my stopwatch.
It's already ringing.
I'm using that joke is costing me time. There's a difference between the substance that should be discussed and the motivations for why the forum exists and why it's there to be discussed. And we shouldn't confuse the two. We'd be foolish, naive was a term that I believe Janet used in a different context about WSIS. We'd be naive if we didn't recognize that we're in this soup of the internet governance debate because governments feel that there's a lack of power, a lack of control about the about how to manage, as Milton in his question helps clarify, ICTs in general, because it's a matter of sovereignty, as well as just kind of a nature of institutions to control things. And much of it is for simple political power. I can tell you there's one European country that kind of wants in simply because it's part of a broader agenda, because it's just been suspicious, naturally suspicious of American power. If we didn't acknowledge those things as real, even though we can't see them, they don't exist like a mouse or a screen, we would be foolish, we'd be kidding ourselves. So the reason why we have the IGF is, I think, a great reason is because of governments pushing the UN in that direction for purposes of political power. On the other hand, there's other substantive issues that probably could be discussed, and as Markus pointed out, just the nature of discussing and showing recognition that you're being heard, like at Speaker's Corner, leads to a good and positive thing.
Thank you, Ken. Martin?
Thank you. Well, actually, I think Ken used up all my time, really. I think having got teenage children, I can really relate to this successive recognition element. And in fact, to a very large extent, I think that the point about, are we in the Internet Governance Forum going to be successful if we just manage to get recognised? Or is it really about redistribution of power? As the parent of teenage children, I would definitely go for the, let's let them be recognised rather than the redistribution of power, for which I feel very uncomfortable because they normally eat quite a lot of my money as it is. But in fact, essentially what you're trying to look at is to understand the issues that are coming out. And just saying, well, actually, we don't like the setup, well, okay, what is it you don't like about the setup? All you'll hear are the revolutionaries, whereas actually a lot of what we have to look at is the evolutionary response that government, society has to make to be able to respond to things that are challenging its way of operation. And governments themselves don't change sort of radically. You know, we have an election, we have a new president in the White House or a new prime minister in number 10, and the following day nothing very much has actually happened. You know, we carry on, but the things then evolve and move around, and that is the sort of framework in which you work. So the important thing, I think, is to actually get you to the stage of the successive recognition bits, where people are actually able to use the forum, the platform, to get out some of the ideas and some of the serious concerns, so that people can then collectively get round and understand how you'll be able to resolve that. So that only partly answers your question, but perhaps it's from a parent of teenage children, it's what we could expect.
Thank you very much. As a concluding remark, the very strong message I take away from this discussion is that we need to be very clear about what we can expect from the forum. And it is crucial to be really precise about that, to avoid disappointment and dismissive approaches towards the whole idea, because people may have had wrong expectations from early on. So I very much thank our panelists. I thank also the audience for your patience and your interesting questions. And I thank also our organizers. So happy reception then.